My phone sat on the kitchen counter, vibrating so violently against the granite that it sounded like a jackhammer drilling into the foundation of my peaceful afternoon. It was the 34th day of silence, the 34th day since my family had collectively decided that a 2-hour drive to witness my wedding vows was simply too much of a physical burden for them to bear. But in the span of 5 minutes, that silence was shattered. Call after call, text after text, the notifications lit up the screen like a flashing warning sign of a collapsing dam. My mother, my father, my sister K.H. Lowe, even the aunts and uncles who hadn't bothered to send so much as a card. They were all blowing up my phone with the kind of frantic desperation that only surfaces when people realize they have made a catastrophic, irreversible error in judgment. I took a slow sip of my chamomile tea, listening to the voicemails pile up, each one more hysterical than the last, pleading for understanding, for forgiveness, and most importantly, for a conversation with my husband. They had sold their golden goose for a ticket to a gender reveal party, and now, staring at the wreckage of their own making, they were finally realizing that the Eskimo they had traded me to was the only person who could save them from the freezing cold of their own consequences. If you have ever been the afterthought in your own family, the child who was expected to show up for everyone else while your own milestones were treated as optional distractions, then you know the specific, stinging pain of being undervalued by the very people who are supposed to love you unconditionally. You know what it feels like to sit in a room full of empty chairs that were meant for you, and you know the quiet, burning desire to see the scales of justice balance themselves out. Hit that like button and subscribe right now, because the story you are about to hear is not just a tale of petty family drama. It is a masterclass in patience, a lesson in the hidden depths of those we underestimate, and a deeply satisfying example of what happens when you stop auditioning for a role in a family that was never meant for you. Get comfortable, because this is a story of silence, secrets, and the kind of revenge that is served not with a shout, but with a quiet, devastating whisper. I was standing on the periphery of a lavish rented beachfront cabana in Malibu, California, shielding my eyes from the glaring Pacific sun, when I finally understood that the hierarchy within my family was not a temporary phase, but a permanent, unalterable institution. It was the second Saturday in June, a day painted in the kind of pristine, almost artificial beauty that you only see in magazines, and my entire extended family had descended upon the coast with the kind of coordination usually reserved for military operations. My parents, my 3 aunts, my 2 uncles, and a half-dozen cousins had all joyfully coordinated flights across 15 states, traveling all the way from the humid, gray suburbs of New Jersey to the pristine, golden coast of Southern California. They were here for a singular, monumental purpose: to attend my younger sister K.H. Lowe's gender reveal party for her unborn twins. It was an event that had been treated with the gravity of a coronation, a celebration of life that had not yet even taken its first breath. My parents had spared absolutely no expense for this occasion, draining their savings and leveraging their social capital to fund a spectacle of sheer, unadulterated excess. They had purchased first-class tickets for themselves, ensuring their comfort across the continent, and had secured luxury oceanfront hotel suites for the extended relatives, putting them up in rooms that cost more per night than my monthly rent. They had hired a professional event planner, a woman with a clipboard and an earpiece who orchestrated a display that culminated in a rented helicopter dropping biodegradable pink and blue confetti over the crashing waves of the Pacific Ocean, while a hired string quartet played pop covers on the sand. The air smelled of expensive perfume, salt water, and the faint, metallic tang of money being burned. I watched my father, a man who routinely complained about the physical toll of his mild arthritis, and used it as an excuse to get out of any activity that didn't interest him, practically sprinting through Newark Airport to make his connection just days prior. I saw my mother, who claimed to be too frail to travel for holidays, spending 3 solid weeks agonizing over the perfect designer pastel outfit to wear for the professional photographer K.H. Lowe had flown in from Lowe's Angels. They were alive, vibrant, and bursting with energy, their ailments conveniently forgotten in the face of the golden child's glory. I had also made the trip, but I was a shadow at the feast. I had quietly purchased my own economy ticket, squeezing into a middle seat near the toilets, and had booked a modest Airbnb a few miles inland because the hotel block had been reserved only for the immediate VIP family, a designation that seemed to exclude me despite my DNA. I had done this because I had still harbored the naive, exhausting illusion that showing up for my family would eventually result in them showing up for me. I spent the entire afternoon observing them from the edge of the cabana, sipping a lukewarm glass of champagne I had to fetch myself, watching my parents fawn over K.H. Lowe and her husband, Greg. Greg was a man whose manufactured charm barely concealed his towering arrogance and deeply precarious financial reality. He stood there in a linen suit that cost more than my car, holding court with my uncles, boasting about venture capital rounds and tech startups, while my sister sat on a velvet throne, her hands resting on her belly, basking in the adoration that was her birthright. Exactly 4 weeks and 2 days after that sun-drenched spectacle in Malibu, I sat in the bridal suite of a quiet, elegant estate nestled in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania. The air here was different, crisp, smelling of pine and earth, a stark contrast to the salty opulence of the West Coast. I stared at my reflection in the vanity mirror, the lace of my wedding dress crisp and white against my skin, while my phone screen remained entirely devoid of notifications from the people who shared my last name. It was my wedding day. It was supposed to be the beginning of a new chapter, a moment of union and joy, yet the silence from my phone was deafening. The venue was exactly a 2-hour and 15-minute drive from my parents' house in New Jersey, a straight shot down the interstate through familiar, easy terrain. There were no connecting flights, no layovers, no need for first-class upgrades, just a simple drive through the countryside. Yet, the 50 chairs carefully arranged on the left side of the aisle, the chairs designated for my family, were completely and utterly empty. 3 days prior, the final blow had been delivered. My mother had called me, her voice dripping with that specific, practiced tone of superficial regret that people use when they have already absolved themselves of any guilt. She informed me that the drive was simply going to be too taxing for them. "Your father's back is just acting up terribly, sweetheart," she had said, her voice entirely unbothered by the astronomical hypocrisy of her statement. "And after all that exhausting travel to California last month, we are just entirely drained." I remembered the way my father had jogged through the terminal, the way my mother had danced on the sand. I remembered the 15 states they had crossed for a party. When I quietly pointed out that they had willingly flown 3,000 miles across the country for a party announcing the gender of children who hadn't even been born yet, but were now claiming that a 2-hour drive to witness their eldest daughter get married was an insurmountable physical hardship, the line had gone quiet for a beat. Then, she sighed heavily into the receiver. "Please don't be difficult, Alina," she had reprimanded me, shifting the blame with the practiced ease of a career narcissist. K.H. Lowe's pregnancy is high risk, and we needed to be there to support her. A wedding is just a party. We'll send a nice gift, but you really shouldn't be so selfish as to demand we put your father's health at risk for a 2-hour car ride. By the end of that day, the synchronized excuses had rolled in from the rest of the clan. A sudden summer cold, a scheduling conflict with a golf tournament, a vague mention of car trouble, it became glaringly obvious that a collective decision had been made. My wedding simply did not warrant their effort. I was the pragmatic, unremarkable sibling, the one who didn't demand attention, the one who didn't throw tantrums, and who consequently didn't require appeasement. I was the sturdy, reliable background character in the blockbuster movie of K.H. Lowe's life. When I had introduced them to my fiancé, David, a quiet, meticulously observant man who dressed entirely in unbranded earth tones and drove a 5-year-old sedan, they had collectively dismissed him as a mundane administrative worker who perfectly matched my supposedly mundane life. They asked him no questions, showed no interest in his background, and patronized him with the same condescending politeness they reserved for waiters and valet drivers. I never corrected their assumptions, nor did David, because we both understood that their lack of curiosity was a symptom of their own self-absorption. They saw what they wanted to see, a middle-class couple living a middle-class life, of no use to their social climbing or financial aspirations. I did not cry in the bridal suite that morning. I did not throw my phone across the room or succumb to the crushing weight of their rejection, because the grief had already been processed 1,000 times over during my childhood. What was left in its wake was a profound, crystalline clarity. I realized that attempting to extract unconditional love from people who view affection as a currency to be spent exclusively on those who enhance their social standing is a fool's errand. I smoothed the lace of my bodice, picked up my bouquet of white ranunculus, and walked out of that room with the absolute certainty that the family I was born into had just voluntarily, permanently severed the cord, completely unaware of the monumental miscalculation they had just made regarding the quiet man I was about to marry. The ceremony took place in the terrace gardens of the estate under a canopy of ancient willow trees, their long branches swaying gently in the breeze. As I walked down the aisle toward David, I consciously refused to let my gaze drift toward the 50 empty wooden chairs on the left side of the lawn. Instead, I focused entirely on the profound warmth in his eyes and the steadfast presence of the friends and mentors who had actually shown up to celebrate our life together. The wedding was incredibly beautiful, intimate, and profoundly peaceful, completely devoid of the chaotic, performative anxiety that usually accompanied any event involving my parents or my sister. There was no jostling for photos, no criticisms of the food, no demands for attention, just pure, unadulterated joy. What my family fundamentally failed to understand, entirely due to their own deliberate, arrogant ignorance, was that the quiet, unassuming man waiting for me at the altar was not the mid-level corporate drone they had smugly assumed him to be. David was the founder and principal managing partner of Horizon Ventures, one of the most aggressive and highly capitalized technology investment firms on the East Coast. He possessed a personal net worth that made my parents' upper-middle-class suburban posturing look like child's play, and he wielded a level of absolute, decisive authority in the corporate sector that men like my brother-in-law Greg spent their entire lives desperately trying to proximity themselves to. The magnificent private estate where we were currently getting married, which my mother had dismissively assumed was some budget-friendly public park when I sent her the address, was actually David's own property, a sweeping 70-acre sanctuary that he maintained with quiet, understated pride. We had intentionally kept the details of our financial and professional realities entirely concealed from my family, not out of malice, but out of a shared, necessary boundary of self-preservation. I knew precisely how my parents operated. If they had known the true extent of David's influence, their entirely absent interest in me would have violently transformed into an obsessive, suffocating campaign to leverage his wealth for their own social elevation and K.H. Lowe's endless financial demands. They would have paraded him at country club dinners, bragged about him to their superficial friends, and relentlessly pressured us to fund whatever lifestyle upgrades they deemed necessary for their manufactured image. Most importantly, I knew that Greg's deeply troubled tech startup, a company he had relentlessly boasted about at every family gathering to mask its staggering operational failures, was currently bleeding capital at an unsustainable rate and desperately seeking a Series B funding injection to avoid total bankruptcy. For the past 18 months, Greg had been obsessively trying to secure a pitch meeting with the elusive executive team at Horizon Ventures, constantly complaining to my parents about the impenetrable wall of gatekeepers preventing him from accessing the firm's legendary CEO, a man whose face was rarely photographed for industry publications and who preferred to operate strictly behind the scenes. My family had spent hours at dining tables lamenting Greg's bad luck, completely oblivious to the fact that the man they were so desperately trying to reach was sitting quietly at the end of that very same table, eating a bread roll and listening to them insult his fiancée's career choices. As David slipped the platinum band onto my finger and the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, I felt a massive, invisible weight lift off my shoulders, the final severing of an emotional chain that had dragged behind me for 3 decades. The reception that followed was a masterpiece of culinary excellence and genuine, unforced joy, filled with brilliant, kind people who knew us deeply and valued our characters over our utility. We drank vintage champagne, danced under an endless canopy of stars, and celebrated without a single moment of manufactured drama or familial obligation. Late in the evening, as the last of the guests were departing and the catering staff was quietly packing away the silver, David and I stood on the stone terrace overlooking the dark, tranquil expanse of the private lake, entirely enveloped in the quiet perfection of our new reality. He wrapped his arms around my shoulders, rested his chin on the top of my head, and asked me if I was okay with how the day had unfolded, given the glaring physical absence of the people who were supposed to love me the most. I leaned back into his embrace, looked at the meticulously manicured grounds of our home, and told him the absolute truth. Their absence was the greatest wedding gift they could have possibly given me, because it permanently eradicated any lingering guilt I might have felt for what was inevitably going to happen next. I had spent my entire life trying to contort myself into a shape that my parents might find acceptable, minimizing my own achievements to avoid overshadowing my sister, and enduring their casual cruelties in the desperate hope that biology would eventually mandate affection. By refusing to drive 2 hours to watch me marry the love of my life simply because they couldn't be bothered to exert the effort for the overlooked child, they had finally, explicitly shown me exactly where I stood in their ledger of priorities. They had drawn a permanent, uncrossable line in the sand, and I was entirely at peace with staying on my side of it forever, especially knowing that the collision course between their suffocating arrogance and David's absolute professional authority was now locked in, inescapable, and ticking down like a metronome toward a spectacular, unavoidable confrontation. Exactly 34 days after our wedding, the carefully constructed facade of my sister's perfect life and my parents' unearned superiority violently collided with the concrete reality of the business world when Greg finally, miraculously, secured his desperate pitch meeting at Horizon Ventures. He had likely pulled every string, called in every favor, and exhausted every connection to get his foot in the door, not realizing that the door was being held open by the very man he had snubbed at family dinners. According to the completely detached, clinical account David gave me later that evening, Greg had swaggered into the spectacular glass-walled boardroom on the 40th floor of the firm's Manhattan headquarters, wearing an aggressive bespoke suit and flanked by 2 nervous junior associates, entirely prepared to deliver the presentation that would supposedly save his sinking company from total financial ruin. He had spent the first 10 minutes confidently setting up his slides and attempting to charm the senior partners, completely oblivious to the fact that the quiet man sitting at the absolute head of the massive mahogany table, reviewing the financial disclosures with an expression of mild professional boredom, was the same man he had refused to make eye contact with at Thanksgiving for the past 3 years. The room was tense, the air conditioning humming softly, the sun glinting off the skyscrapers of the city that never sleeps. When David finally closed the dossier, steepled his fingers, and looked up to address the room, the color drained from Greg's face with such terrifying speed that one of the partners instinctively reached for the water pitcher, assuming the man was experiencing a sudden cardiac event. Recognition is a powerful, visceral thing. It hits the stomach before it hits the brain. Greg stared at David, his mouth slightly agape, as the realization washed over him. The mundane administrative worker, the man he had dismissed as a nobody, was the titan of industry he had been begging to see. David did not raise his voice, nor did he make a single personal comment or bring up the wedding. He simply proceeded to methodically, surgically, and entirely objectively dismantle the catastrophic structural flaws in Greg's business model. He pointed out the unsustainable burn rate, the inflated user acquisition metrics, and the glaring lack of proprietary technology. He treated Greg exactly the way he would treat any deeply unqualified applicant, delivering a masterclass in professional execution that ended with a calm, polite, and absolute refusal to invest a single dollar of Horizon's capital into a fundamentally doomed enterprise. Greg was escorted out of the building in a state of catatonic shock, his bespoke suit suddenly looking like a costume, his confidence shattered like glass on a concrete floor. Within exactly 2 hours, my cell phone, which had remained peacefully silent from my family's end for over a month, began to violently detonate with incoming calls, text messages, and frantic voicemails. I was sitting on the back porch of our estate with a cup of chamomile tea, watching the afternoon sun filter through the oak trees, when I finally decided to answer the 14th consecutive call from my mother. Her voice, usually so composed and dripping with practiced condescension, was a shrill, hysterical mess of panic and deeply transparent manipulation. She desperately tried to weave a narrative where they had always adored David, where there had simply been a terrible misunderstanding about the wedding, and where I, as a loyal daughter and sister, needed to immediately intervene and force my husband to reverse his decision to save K.H. Lowe's future. Alina, darling, you have to understand. Greg is entirely ruined without this funding. They'll lose the house. The twins are coming. You cannot let David do this to your own family. She wept, entirely forgetting that just 5 weeks earlier, she had explicitly told me that I was selfish for expecting them to endure a 2-hour car ride to watch me get married. She was panicking, not for me, but for the lifestyle they were about to lose. I let her speak. I let her exhaust herself against the impenetrable wall of my silence. I listened to the guilt trips, the gaslighting, the desperate pleas that shifted from love to threats and back to love again in a dizzying cycle. Then, I took a slow sip of my tea, savoring the absolute stillness of the air around me, the birds singing in the distance, the rustle of the leaves. I spoke into the receiver with a voice so profoundly calm and detached that it sounded like a stranger to my own ears. My family, I said slowly, emphasizing the words so they hung heavily in the digital space between us, consists of my husband and the people who actually showed up to celebrate our union. You made it abundantly clear that a 2-hour drive was simply too exhausting a journey to support me. So I am absolutely certain you will understand that walking all the way to my husband's home office to ask him to compromise his billion-dollar firm for a man who couldn't even RSVP to our wedding is simply too taxing on my energy. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't need to hear the apologies or the screaming. I hung up the phone. I blocked her number. I blocked my father's number. I blocked K.H. Lowe's number. I systematically severed every digital and social tie connecting me to the people who had raised me, finalizing the boundary that they themselves had initiated. The fallout was total and irreversible. Greg's startup officially filed for bankruptcy 3 months later, forcing my parents to drastically dip into their beloved retirement savings to bail out K.H. Lowe's mortgage, effectively ending their days of extravagant cross-country flights and performative country club wealth. I have spent the subsequent years reflecting on what I would tell anyone who finds themselves perpetually positioned as the afterthought in their own family, the child expected to absorb endless disrespect while continuously offering unquestioning loyalty. The lesson is this: blood does not mandate submission, and sharing a last name does not require you to permanently anchor yourself to people who view your existence as an inconvenience until it becomes an asset. When people show you that their love is conditional, transactional, and entirely dependent on what you can do for their public image, you must believe them the very first time. You must give yourself the profound, liberating permission to stop auditioning for a role they never intended to cast you in. You do not owe your success to the people who ignored you in the dark, and you absolutely do not owe them a seat at the table once you have built your own castle in the light. Your greatest revenge is not anger or confrontation. It is absolute, unbothered peace. A peace achieved by quietly stepping out of their toxic narrative and allowing the natural consequences of their own arrogance to completely and utterly dismantle them, while you sit quietly on your porch drinking tea and watching the sunset over a life they will never, ever be a part of. If this story gave you chills and you believe that silence is sometimes the loudest scream of all, smash that like button and tell us in the comments. What is the most satisfying way you have ever seen karma play out in your own life? And of course, subscribe for more stories like this, where the underdog finally gets their day in the sun.